Hello all. Today I thought let's go through a very interesting topic when it comes to developing the bots in Azure. So with the inception of AI, we are adopting different ways of creating the bots, and there are some specific scenarios when we turn towards creating a much customizable bot and adopt solutions like Azure bot framework where we can, create flexible, complex, all sorts of bot scenarios. Okay. So there is one very specific functionality which comes into the picture that is known as streaming. Right? So all of us must have explored the Azure AI Open Studio, and we really like that interface. When your answer, as soon as you send your query, your answer just starts getting streamed on the screen, chunk by chunk, word by word, and it's very user friendly. But when it comes to implementing that, right? So using Azure OpenAI as a REST API, it does not gives us that flexibility right away, right? Because you get different chunks, then you don't understand how to, manipulate those, display those values. So you end up getting all the data at once with the streaming option turned off, and that leads to a much longer wait time. So how do we actually implement the streaming? Right. So first of all, if you are using any Copilot or any such tool which just calls the Azure REST API, in that case, you will not be able to implement it right straight away, right? Because in order to implement that, you need a bot in the Azure bot framework or a Azure bot, right? And then you can modify your packages within the Azure bot framework, which we are going to see, and then implement that scenario. Okay, so how do we get started? So this is just a test bot which I've created in a composer, right? So you can create a bot in the Azure framework composer, or you can go in and create a bot in the Visual Studio directly. But since this is a visual interface, a much better interface from the look and feel perspective, easier to create. So we always tend to, create a bot in the Azure bot framework. So this is what I have done. I've just created a new bot, a blank bot with nothing in it. It is the default intents that are available, the greeting one and the unknown intent, and I don't have anything in this. Now, Azure Bot Framework Composer and Azure Bot SDK, both of them are tightly coupled together, right? So at the back end, this thing will also create a solution for you. So all you need to do is just go in and open that solution in Visual Studio, right? So if I'll show you that. Okay, so this is how the solution comes up in Visual Studio, right? So if you see here, there are different dependencies, right? There are different properties, there is a root, then all these folders are by default created. Whatever dialogues you're going to end within your bot, like whatever you are going to add from the composer, those will come in here as JSONs. So a whole solution structure is created. Now, first of all, what you need to do is, so I'll also share the references or links to the actual GitHub repositories and the Microsoft repositories which talk about this, right? So first thing that you need to do is just go to the properties of your project, right? And you need to change your target framework from .NET 3.1, .NET Core 3.1 to .NET 8.0, right? So this is very important because first of all, .NET Core 3.1, which is the default framework selected for the Azure Bot Composer, right? So that is running out of support. It does not get any further support from Microsoft. So it's good to upgrade your package. And also the NuGet package that we are using, it needs .NET 8.0, right? For the streaming purpose. So once you upgrade it to .NET 8.0, the second thing is just go to your dependencies in the packages, add this Azure AI OpenAI package, right? So how do you add it? Just go on packages, right click, manage NuGet packages, and you get the list here. So just search it and install it, right? So after doing that, you get that package here. So first thing you need to do is, so just download two files, right? So I'll share the link, as I said, for the GitHub repository, which Microsoft has suggested. So there are two files that you need to download. One is a dialog file and a dialog wrapper file. You create a folder, like in this instance, we are using the same terminology which Microsoft has suggested, that is migrated dialogs, but you can use any name here. And how do we modify that? I'll let you know, right? So just create a folder here with any name and add those files here. Now, what exactly are these files and how do we correlate it with streaming? So first, let's look at the wrapper file, right? So this is the wrapper file. Now, as I mentioned, you can use any folder name. So the only difference is this namespace has to be the namespace of your solution. That is, you can come to the your startup file and check the namespace here. So the namespace mentioned here should be the namespace of your dialog wrapper, and the input property details dot the name of the folder. So if I'll change it to some other thing, you can mention it that folder name here, right? Then you have a class, right? So in the wrapper, so first let's go through the wrapper. So you have a component dialog, right? And that component dialog basically defines the structure of it, the begin dialog async function, the end dialog async function. Then it relates to the SDK dialog class, which is the class that has all the functionalities. Then an extension class that is added, and the extension class is added so that while the begin dialog async happens, right? So we have created a custom property class, that is the input property details. Now this property details is used to get the details from your Azure Bot Composer to your application, right? So now if I'll like if you remember in the Azure Bot Composer, so I'll show you later on, whenever we start begin a dialog, so you get an option to add the properties there, right? So there, if you'll create a property by the name of input property, input history, input index, input model, so it'll get all those values using the cast function as an object to your SDK class, right? So basically, this is a input mechanism from your composer, from your visual interface to your backend, that is your SDK. So this class is set up. We have all these functions created. Then the next thing is SDK dialog, which is our main class, right? So this is a pretty straightforward function for the message. So as we know, there is a JSON for the messages that we send. There is a role, there is a content, right? Role can be your system, it can be your user, it can be your assistant, and the content can be various different things. It can be a system prompt, it can be a user prompt, or it can end up being a assistant prompt, which is returned by the assistant, right? So this message class helps with that. Then in the SDK class, right? So first of all is we set up the configuration in the constructor, right? And then you use a waterfall dialog. Now, what is a waterfall dialog? The waterfall dialog is used to perform a step of actions, right? So the function that we are calling here, so that is the first function. Whenever I'll add this dialog into my composer, this function will start a waterfall dialog, which is going to call add step async, right? And the add step async will have a step context, which will contain all the options, which are the properties that I'm getting from my front end, right? So this basically is my function where all the logic will happen. Now, what I've done is from the step context, I have taken all the properties I added on my front end, and I have got all those properties in my property details, right? And from the property details, I'm getting my input property, which is basically the user prompt, which I need, right? So now I have my user prompt from my front end. I have added an endpoint and key. So these are the Azure OpenAI endpoint and the Azure OpenAI key. Then I've created a chat message list, right? Now this chat message list has a class being used, that is the OpenAI.chat message class, right? Now this class, as you can see, so this is from the package that we added. It has all the descriptions of the different types of messages that we use, right? So it is a system prompt, a user prompt, assistant prompt, tool chat, and all that. So we are going to use it down in the functions, right? Then the next thing is Azure OpenAI client. So in order to interact with the Azure OpenAI, we need the client, right? So we create a client with the endpoint and the key. So it's a straightforward function. Then the next step is you create a chat client, right? So your Azure client is created, the OpenAI client is created. Now we need to interact with the model and get a chat client for it. So you enter your model name here, right? So it can be your GPT-4, it can be your GPT-4 Turbo, GPT-4 Omni, GPT 3.5, any model that you are using, the deployed model name will come in here, right? And then we again have a message list known as the message list, which is using the message class, right, which we have created. So now we have two lists here, right? So one is using the default Azure OpenAI package class, and one is using the class that we created. The next thing, so we'll use a couple of JSON objects here, right? So as we know, the messages that we pass to the Azure OpenAI has to be in this particular format, right? The messages array along with the role and the content. So the prompt that we are sending is a user prompt, right? So we have added the role as user and the content as input text, which is the prompt that is coming from the property details or the front end. And the second thing is the second step rather, or the next step is like, okay, so this is the JSON I have, right? So I've passed it into a JSON object. Now I need it as an array, right? So what I'll do is create a JArray message, right, from the JSON. So this is the JSON and the object that I'm using inside the JSON is the messages. So this array that I have here, which you see between the square braces, now this array is converted to my message JArray, right? And from the message array, I'm converting it to the object message list, which I had created here. Now, message list is the list of messages, right? And messages had two properties, content and role. So both of those properties are available in this object. So in my message list, now I have two objects, like one value that is role is user and content is the prompt, right? We'll come to this code later on. Okay, so the next is completion update. So I'm missing a method here. So let me add that code, right? So the messages that we created. Now, since we have it in the message list, so why did we create this messages, right? Because my complete chat streaming, which basically does the, operation and get the data from the Azure, right? So it has to have a parameter with the chat message type, right? I enable parameter with the chat message type. So what we are doing now is that from the message list, we are converting all the values to the messages. So if my message list has a role type that is system, so it will add a system chat message. If it's user, it will add a user chat message. If it's neither of those, it will add a system chat message, right? So all of that is now added in my messages list. So my message list is ready with the user role, the content that adds in which I have stored my prompt, right? So, so far so good. What we have done, just to recap, have the endpoint and keys, right? Got our properties from the front end using the composer, right? Then traverse those properties, created my prompt, created my chat client, right? And finally, I'm going to call the streaming chat completions update function, right? So streaming chat completions update is the class that we are using, and we are going to call the complete chat streaming function. So now what will happen is this message is passed to this particular function, and it will start returning your chunks, right? And those chunks are captured in streaming chat completion update. That is the completion updates object that we have created here, right? So the first chunk will come, this for each will keep on going along with the chunks that it will receive, right? Now let's look at what we have done here. Okay, so there are two things. Whenever we are working with the Azure Bot SDK, right? So there are two functions. One is send activity async, and the second one is update activity async, right? So ideally, if we look at adding a content or loading the content one by one, so you are replacing that content continuously, right? So send activity async will send a message once, but update activity async will let you update a message and keep on updating it with the newer content step by step, right? So it will edit the message, replace it with the newer content. So if you have 50 words loaded as the first chunk, you will replace it with the next 50, total of 100 words in the next iteration, right? So that's why we are going to use the update activity async function here. So now what I'm doing is, first of all, I'll have to check if it's the first time that it's the first chunk, or then the second thing is how many words do I need to, display at once. So I do not want to display one word by word by word, right? So I can set a limit that, okay, for 50 words, once you have the chunks for all the 50 words in the reply that you are giving, then display the next 100, right? Then display 150. So like that, so that it gets some meat to it, right? So now we start with the for each, right? And then in the streaming chat completion update, we have the content update. So we use that and we get the content part from it. And then the content part has the text value to it. So now this text is your response, right? So if it is not null or empty, we add it to our message builder, the string builder, which will keep on updating with the newer content that we receive. And we increase our counter from 0 to 1, right? And then we check if my bot message builder length is greater than 0. If it's greater than 0, right? So we don't do anything. Like if we get into this, if it's not greater than 0, we don't do anything because we don't have anything in the bot message builder, right? So if it's the first time execution, then what I need to do is I need to create, right? I need to do the send activity async, right? Why? Because it's the first message. So I do not have any message that I need to update. So for the first message, we'll do the send activity async, right? And the old activity is basically just the message that is there, right, from the boss message builder. So it will send that message, the first chunk, using send activity async, right? And then we'll capture the ID of this message into this particular field, right? And we'll set it to false. Now, once it will come for the second time, now, first time is false. It will come here. It will first look for counter is equal to word count. So it will first look if my 50 words are completed. So if 50 iterations are done, 50 words are completed, it will come in here. Now it has the newer message. And what we'll do is for the new activity, right? We'll set the ID to the old activity, right? So to the earlier activity that we had, right? And we'll display this new activity. So now it is going to rewrite that particular message. So if I had just 50 words there, now it is going to update it with the 100 words, right? So like that, this loop will keep on going and it will display your streamed message. So in explanation, it looks a little slow, but it's really fast and it's really swift, right? So it will keep on updating, it will keep on updating, and you can see that, right? And once all that is done, so finally you display your final message, right? So you display that and then it's done. So you have it in your bot message builder, like you have it in your input properties, and you just return that property back to your composer, right? So this is how your streaming is going to work. So it's straightforward. It looks a little complicated, but the main functions that we need to take care of is creating the Azure clients, right? How do we get the values, right? How do we get the values from the input properties to my particular, to a format in which my function can take it, my streaming function can take it. That is the list of the chat messages, right? And then how do we traverse the response so that we can update the activity every time that we are doing it, right? So this is the piece of code that helps you with that. Now the next question that comes in is that, okay, this is just a simple scenario where we are not using any of our own data, right? So how do we use our own data into this? So for that, the answer is this particular piece of code, right? Let me just uncomment it. Okay, so now I've uncommented this, right? So you can see, so this is basically a newer package, right, which Microsoft has provided. So it is subject to changes. So that's why you need to add this warning disable AOAI 001, right? So you need to create an object of chat completions options class. Now this chat completion options class provides you a function to add your data source, right? So now we are creating a data source of Azure Search Chat data source type. So I have a Azure Search service which I want to add to my particular call so that my data comes in from that service. Now once we do that, parameters are now pretty much similar to the REST API. So if you have worked on that, you can see. So you just need to provide the endpoint of your search service, the index name, your authentication is from the API key of the search service, then the top end documents you need to load, and in case you need to add any more parameters, so you have all those here. So you can add your field mappings, right? So what will be your content fields, your vectors fields, then in scope, right? Then you have your query type, your role information, your semantic configuration, strictness, and all those values here, right? So all that parameters can go in here, and in case you need to add other details, so that are available under the options, right? So you can add your temperature value and your frequency penalty, p values, and all those things into this particular thing, right? So these two methods, like options object and the data source, can be used to further configure your API calls, further configure your call to the Azure OpenAI and get the responses according to that. So once you create this option, the next step that you need to do is just come in here and in your complete chat streaming, add this as a second parameter, right? Because we need to send it to our function to in order to get that evaluated. So now once I do this, it will start calling my Azure OpenAI and get the data from my own data source, right? Instead of just the GPT. So this is how this whole streamed function is going to work. This is how the whole streaming concept is going to work. So now I'll add a reference to this particular code base GitHub into the comments, right? That's a generic code base with Microsoft have provided. In case you need any help with the code with specific to this particular thing, so let me know, I'll share this. Now let's look at one final step. So that is just to make it a bit more clear. So let's look at how we are going to add this dialog to our composer, right? So we have done this. So now, in order to add it to the composer, first thing is we need to register this in the startup, right? So just come to the startup and add these two lines here. That is add singleton. So we add a dialog for the SDK dialog type, and then we add another dialog for the wrapper, right? So this is how we add it. So now once we have done all this, yeah, so the next thing that we need to do is come to your composer, come here, go to dialog management, begin a new dialog, right? And in the dialog name, just go to write an expression and say SDK dialog wrapper, right? And property, this is the return type. So if you're returning any value from your dialog, you can provide a property here and it'll get that name. So we'll look at that. I'll create another video for conversation history so that it'll be useful there, right? And then this options was about what I was talking about. So we add new, and if I need to add a input property, right? So I do that here, and in the value I am going to add turn dot recognized dot text, right? So it will get me the previous text that was added. Now this value will be rendered in my SDK, right? So this is how it works. This is how it's going to work. So it's a little complicated, but once you start implementing it, it's going to, work really well. And I hope it's a bit clearer now. You are able to, see and understand how this thing works and how the streaming works. And once you get implemented, it's definitely going to help you, gain much better feedback from the users in terms of the response time, and it basically enhances the functionality. So in case of any queries, any suggestions, any questions, or any help that you need, please feel free to comment. And for anything related to this particular video, all the references would be added in the description. Thank you. Have a nice day.